I want you to completely erase the image you currently have of the Middle Ages or, the early Renaissance.
Right, just throw it out entirely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Forget the sweeping Hollywood historical dramas. Strip away the pristine stone castles, those glittering velvet gowns, the perfectly choreographed feasts.
And the soft lute music playing in the background.
Yes. We have this huge tendency to look at history through a heavily sanitized, romantic filter. But today, we're going to look at the actual documented reality.
The really messy reality.
Oh, it's so messy. And to do that, you need to picture yourself stepping into the great hall of an English noble's house. First, tilt your camera down to the floor. You aren't stepping on clean flagstones. You're stepping onto a thick layer of marsh rushes.
Rushes that, in many documented cases, haven't been swept out or completely changed in years, sometimes decades, honestly.
Which is just horrifying when you realize what's actually trapped inside them. Underneath that top layer of relatively fresh straw, there's a festering, compressed biological nightmare. We're talking spilled, sour beer, congealed animal grease, shattered fish bones, human spittle, vomit, and the daily waste of both the household dogs and, well, the people themselves.
The smell alone would probably knock a modern person entirely unconscious.
Honestly, yeah. Now, holding your breath, I want you to look up from that floor and look over at the grand dining table. Standing there is a young nobleman. He's maybe 12 years old. And he is sweating profusely, shaking with absolute terror, holding a carving knife over a roasted crane.
Because he knows with, absolute certainty that if his knife slips even a fraction of an inch,
Right.
if he hits a specific bone in that bird's chest and ruins the presentation of the meat for the lord of the house, he is going to be dragged away and brutally, physically beaten.
It completely shatters the illusion, doesn't it? That is the visceral, unvarnished reality of the past. Welcome to today's deep dive.
I'm so excited for this one.
Me too. Our mission today is to explore a stack of incredibly dense, just unbelievably fascinating source material that rips the polite veneer right off of English history. We are looking at an 1868 publication which was later updated and reprinted in 1894 and 1904 by a completely obsessive, brilliant group called the Early English Text Society, or the ETS.
Yeah, and this specific volume is edited by a man named Frederick Furnivall, and it contains these sweeping forewords on early English education, exhaustive catalogs of global academic preservation efforts, and a collection of bizarre medieval treatises.
Treatises with amazing titles like The Book of Nurture.
The broader mission here is just so vital for anyone who loves language, history, or just human psychology because, to truly understand the English language, you can't just read the high-minded poetry of Chaucer or the polished plays of Shakespeare in a vacuum.
No, of course not.
You cannot separate a language from the environment in which it was spoken. You have to understand the gritty, hyper-structured, and sometimes terrifying daily lives of the actual human beings who spoke it.
And the ETs completely understood this. They undertook this monumental, agonizing effort to rescue this social history from literally rotting away in the forgotten damp archives of Europe.
Which is exactly what was happening.
I can promise you by the end of this deep dive, you will never look at the English language, the concept of a university education, or even your own dining room table the same way again.
Definitely not.
So, let's get into the mechanics of this rescue mission.
Yeah.
Because the story of the Early English Text Society itself is almost as wild as the medieval manuscripts they were trying to save. Let's look at what Dr. Furnivall and his colleagues were actually up against when they founded the society in 1864.
They were basically up against a ticking clock and just widespread societal apathy. Their explicit goal, written right into their founding documents, was to bring the mass of Old English literature within the reach of the ordinary student.
Right.
But there was a deeply felt nationalistic motivation, too. They wanted to wipe away what they called the national reproach under which England had long rested.
The reproach being that England, as a nation, seemed to care very little about its own early language and daily life.
Yeah.
Which is wild to think about from a modern perspective, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Today, the UK exports its history as one of its primary cultural products. You've got The Crown, endless Tudor documentaries, historical fiction everywhere.
Exactly. But in the mid-19th century, Furnivall and his colleagues were walking through cathedral libraries and private manor archives, and they're just watching irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind vellum manuscripts literally turning to dust or being eaten by mice.
They realized they were losing the cultural code of their own civilization, and it was a massive structural undertaking to fix it. They didn't just casually publish a book here or there. They organized their efforts meticulously.
They launched the original series, right? which focused on completely unprinted manuscripts.
Yeah, but the sheer volume of material forced them by 1867 to open an extra series. The second series was devoted to creating fresh, accurate editions of texts that had been printed before.
Like William Caxton's early books.
Exactly. Caxton stuff and other rare black letter books that were completely inaccessible to a normal person.
I want to pause on that term, black letter books, for a second, just to make sure we're visualizing this correctly. We aren't talking about easily readable paperbacks here.
Oh, not at all. Black letter refers to the Gothic script used in early printing presses and late medieval manuscripts. It is incredibly dense, heavy, dark lettering that is notoriously difficult for modern eyes to read.
It just looks like a wall of spiky ink.
It does. The letters often bleed together, the spelling is entirely phonetic and wildly inconsistent, and the texts are full of archaic abbreviations. Transcribing just one page of a black letter manuscript requires intense linguistic training and hours of painstaking focus.
So you have this group of academics squinting by gaslight, trying to decipher these crumbling, complex texts. And the part that makes this feel incredibly relatable to me, like someone trying to launch an NT project today, is that they were completely perpetually broke.
Oh, they had no money.
Right. They operated on a subscription model. If you joined the society, you paid 1 guinea a year, which is £1 and 1 shilling. I read that and instantly thought, this is just a 19th century Patreon campaign. They're crowdsourcing the salvation of the English language.
That analogy holds up perfectly when you look at how they communicated with their subscribers. The prefaces Furnivall wrote read exactly like frustrated Kickstarter updates.
Yes.
They were doing this incredibly vital, backbreaking academic work, and the British public largely ignored them. The texts lament this quite bitterly. Furnivall points out the sheer hypocrisy of the intellectual class at the time.
He brings up the Hellenic Society, right?
He does. He notes that the Hellenic Society, which was dedicated to studying ancient Greece, had nearly 1,000 well-funded members. Meanwhile, the ETs, studying their own ancestors, didn't even have 300 subscribers.
Furnivall actually writes that it is nothing less than a scandal. You can feel his blood boiling through the academic prose. He writes that the cry of Great Britain and her colonies in the matter of language is still, let the dead past bury its dead.
It's so dramatic.
But it's true. They couldn't get people to care about the history in their own backyards because it wasn't considered as glamorous or classical as Roman or Greek history.
And the scale of what they were trying to accomplish with those meager funds is staggering. This wasn't like a 5-year project. In their 1904 update, so 40 years after they started, they noted they still had 50 solid years of work already sitting on their printing lists.
Wow.
And they predicted that, at their current pace, there were easily another 100 to 200 years of work waiting out there in the archives. They explicitly, soberly stated that the year 2000 would come and go, and the society would still not be finished printing all the early texts.
Staring up at a mountain of crumbling parchment, knowing you'll die long before you reach the summit, and just choosing to keep transcribing anyway, it requires a specific kind of beautiful madness.
It really does.
But I think we need to interrogate the core motivation here. Beyond just the antiquarian urge to collect old things, why were they so desperate to print every single early English manuscript? What is the actual mechanical value to a modern language student?
Well, the text provides a very clear, forceful answer to that. Furnivall argues that until all early English manuscripts are printed and accessible, no proper history of our language or social life is possible. This is the crucial takeaway.
Yeah.
Language is not a sterile mathematical set of grammatical rules that exists in a vacuum. It is a living, breathing organism that is entirely shaped by material conditions.
Meaning, the words we invent are dictated by the things we need to touch, the food we need to eat, and the people we need to talk to.
Precisely. The vocabulary of a culture is shaped by how they build their roofs, how they treat their sick, and how they navigate social hierarchies. If you only study the grand macro-level documents, the political treaties signed by kings, or the polished theological sermons delivered by bishops, you are getting a highly curated artificial version of the language.
It's the PR version of English.
Exactly. You're missing the language as it was actually used in the kitchens, the taverns, and the nurseries.
I love that perspective. It's like trying to understand the social dynamics of the 21st century internet by exclusively reading the terms of service agreements for various websites and completely ignoring social media feeds, meme culture, and forum slang.
That is a perfect analogy.
You'd have a technically accurate view of the legal framework, but zero understanding of the actual humans using the network. The ETS wanted the whole messy human picture.
Which brings up one of those fascinating historical paradoxes in these sources. England simply did not have the internal momentum, the funding, or even the specialized academic workforce to do this massive project alone.
Right.
So they had to look outward. Saving the origins of the English language required an unprecedented global alliance.
This part of the text genuinely made me laugh out loud because the irony is just so thick. Think about the geopolitical reality of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mid-Victorian and Edwardian Britain.
Oh,
They're at the absolute zenith of their imperial power. They are colonizing the globe, painting the map pink, projecting this image of supreme British superiority and self-sufficiency. And yet, when it comes to rescuing and translating their own foundational national identity, their own ancient language, they have to outsource the labor.
the sources actually talk about the annexation of large tracts of our early English territory by foreign scholars.
It is a brilliant irony, but we need to look at why that was the case. Why were foreign scholars better equipped to study early English than the English themselves?
It comes down to the evolution of academia on the European continent versus in Britain. During the 19th century, particularly in Germany, there was a massive revolution in the field of philology.
Let's define philology for the listener, just so we're on the same page.
Philology is essentially the study of language in oral and written historical sources. It's a combination of literary criticism, history, and linguistics. The German universities had turned this into a rigorous, systematic, almost biological science.
They were treating language like anatomy.
Yes, exactly. They were tracing the evolutionary roots of Germanic languages, of which English is one. So, while English antiquarians were treating old manuscripts like quaint local hobbies, German scholars had developed the actual scientific frameworks needed to decode vowel shifts, dialect variations, and syntactic structures.
So the English essentially had to import the scientific method of language study. The EETS texts list this absolute all-star roster of global contributors.
It's a huge list.
There's a massive German contingent scholars with names like Zipitza, Kolbing, and Hausknecht. There are Scandinavians like Erdmann and Koch. There are Dutch scholars like Logeman, French heavyweights like Paul Meyer and Gaston Paris, alongside Italians, Austrians, and Americans like Professor Child and Dr. Triggs.
And instead of feeling threatened by this, the ETS embraced it. If you read these dry, highly technical academic prefaces, you suddenly stumble into these deeply emotional expressions of gratitude.
It's surprisingly sweet.
It is. The ETS editors describe this international sympathy and help as the pleasantest experiences of the society's life. They talk about how this shared labor wove a bond between lovers of language across the seas. It was a lifeline that kept them going amidst all the financial discouragement from their own countrymen.
The international brotherhood of the book.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful concept, and it proves a vital point about linguistics, I think. A language ultimately belongs not just to its native speakers or its country of origin, but to anyone willing to put in the grueling, specialized work to study and preserve it.
Right?
Sometimes it takes an outsider's sterile, objective perspective to see the mechanics of a language that native speakers just take for granted.
That is exactly right. The native speaker is often blind to the structure of their own tongue. So with this global army of philologists assembled, the question becomes, what specifically were they uncovering? We've talked about the high-minded reasons for preserving texts, but a huge portion of this effort wasn't dedicated to grand epics about dragons or theological debates.
No, it wasn't.
It was dedicated to the astonishingly intense, hyper-specific rules of everyday behavior.
Which brings us to the actual content of these rescued texts, specifically the books of nurture and courtesy. And this is where the daily reality of the Middle Ages hits you like a truck.
It really does.
The ETS introduces us to a fascinating figure named John Russell and his Book of Nurture. John Russell wasn't a poet, he wasn't a monk, and he wasn't a philosopher. He was the usher and marshal to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester.
Let's contextualize how important that job title is. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was a brother to King Henry V.
So royalty.
Very close to the throne. He was a massive political player, a patron of learning, and a ferocious collector of manuscripts. His collection essentially laid the foundation for the famous Bodleian Library at Oxford. So John Russell was the man managing the daily household logistics for one of the most powerful, cultured, and wealthy men in the entire English kingdom.
He was the ultimate operations manager. And in his old age, Russell decides to write a manual. He states he wants to train worthy successors in the art and mystery of managing a noble household. But this isn't a vague philosophical guide to leadership.
Not at all.
It is a grueling, obsessively detailed manual on mealtime etiquette and the physical duties of serving.
Obsessive is definitely the right word. These courtesy books functioned as literal survival manuals for young people navigating the treacherous social waters of a noble court.
It reads exactly like a modern, hyper-specific YouTube tutorial or a life hack blog, but with life or death stakes. Russell provides the definitive guide to folding napkins in complex shapes, the exact temperatures to serve different wines, and most importantly, how to carve meat.
Yes.
The carving. There's an entire highly technical section on carving birds. Let's go back to that 12-year-old boy I mentioned at the beginning of the deep dive, the one carving the crane. Russell explicitly warns the carver that when breaking down a crane, you must beware the trump in his breast.
The trump. This is a perfect example of why the ETs felt these texts were vital. The trump refers to a very specific, tough, trumpet-shaped bone and cartilage structure in the crane's breast.
Okay.
If a young carver's knife hits that structure, the blade slips, the meat tears, the juices splatter, and the presentation is completely ruined.
I was trying to think of a modern equivalent to the stress of this moment. It's not just messing up dinner. It's like being forced to defuse a bomb in front of a live audience of the most powerful people in the country.
That is exactly what it felt like.
One slip of the knife, and your entire social standing detonates.
Yeah.
Because in this society, presentation and hierarchy were everything. A public failure at the carving table wasn't just a faux pas, it was a deep humiliation that reflected poorly on your master, which inevitably led to the physical beatings we'll get into shortly.
And John Russell's manual was considered so valuable, so essential to understanding these high-stakes social mechanics, that it actually sparked a literary scandal, which the ETS editors gleefully uncovered and documented.
Oh, this is fantastic. I love historical drama.
So good.
So decades after Russell writes his manuscript, early printing presses start popping up in England. And there's a very famous early printer named Wynkyn de Worde. He was a prominent figure, a direct successor to William Caxton, who brought the printing press to England. Wynkyn de Worde prints a highly successful book called The Book of Carrying, The Book of Carving.
But the ETS scholars, because they were meticulously comparing all these different manuscripts side by side, noticed something suspicious. Wynkyn de Worde had blatantly plagiarized John Russell's work.
He just lifted the material wholesale.
He really did.
But the mechanics of how he plagiarized it tell us so much about early printing, because he couldn't just copy and paste. He was working with physical, movable type, block printing. Every single letter had to be placed by hand in a frame.
Right.
If a line of Russell's poetry was too long to fit the width of de Worde's expensive paper, de Worde couldn't just shrink the font size like we do on a computer. He had to physically alter the words to make them fit the margins.
It's the 16th century equivalent of lazily copying someone's homework, but changing the syntax so the teacher doesn't notice, only he's doing it because of the physical constraints of early typesetting.
Exactly. The ETS text gives this brilliant, concrete example. John Russell originally wrote a rhyming couplet about fritters. A pulfrucher is good hoot, but the cold ye not touch. Meaning, apple fritters are good when they are hot, but don't touch the cold ones.
Solid advice.
Wynkyn de Worde, trying to cram this into his prose formatting, just hacks the syntax apart. He changes it to, apple fruiters have been good hoat, and all cold fruiters touch not. He ruins the rhyme and shuffles the syllables just to make the metal type fit the page.
It's so clumsy.
Furnivall, the ETS editor, calls him a bare-faced plagiarist in the footnotes. You could tell Furnivall thoroughly enjoyed catching this 400-year-old printer in a lie.
But beyond the drama of plagiarism, the ETS preserved a multitude of other courtesy texts. Another critical one is a treatise called Urbanitatis. This document outlines the rules of behavior taught to young men, specifically the henchmen of King Edward IV.
King Edward V's inner circle.
Yes. And this is where the romantic illusion of the pristine, noble knight completely disintegrates.
Completely, because the rules in Urbanitatis are incredibly basic, which implies the baseline behavior was absolutely feral. The text explicitly orders these young noblemen not to spit in the hall. It tells them not to snite, which is the early English word for blowing your nose with your fingers. And, most tellingly, they are strictly forbidden from wiping their noses on the dining tablecloth.
When you're analyzing historical law or etiquette, the rule of thumb is you do not write a rule prohibiting a behavior unless that behavior is a persistent, widespread problem.
Right. They weren't writing rules against wiping your nose on the tablecloth as a preventative measure. They wrote it because the dupe's tablecloths were constantly covered in snot.
Precisely. And this loops back to the ETS's core argument about the value of these texts for understanding language. Why did they spend so much of their limited funds printing the Book of Nurture and Urbanitatis?
Mm.
Because these etiquette manuals are the only places where the exact vocabulary of medieval material culture is preserved.
I really want to hammer this point home for the listener. A cloistered monk writing a theological tract in Latin is never going to list the 14 distinct verbs used to carve different types of meat. A king writing a treaty isn't going to use the specific regional term for a crumb brush or detail the recipe for hot apple fritters.
Exactly.
The courtesy books give us the job titles like the panter, who was the officer in charge of the pantry and the bread, or the sewer, who was the high-ranking servant responsible for tasting and placing the dishes on the table.
If we want to know what these people touched, what they tasted, what tools they held in their hands, and what words they used to describe their physical reality, we absolutely need these mundane, everyday manuals. They anchor the evolution of the English language in physical reality.
Okay, so we know what the rules were. Don't whack your nose on the table. Don't hit the trump in the crane. But I am intensely curious about the how. How did medieval society actually enforce these incredibly intricate, high-stakes rules on children? Because kids are kids, whether it's the year 1400 or 2024, they don't naturally care about the precise angle of a carving knife.
Well, the answer the source material provides is deeply unsettling. The medieval and early modern upper classes did not teach their own children. They relied on a widespread, systemic process of outsourcing parenting, combined with a normalized culture of extreme physical discipline.
Let's dig into this system, which was known as fostering out. If you were an upper-class child, a boy or a girl, your parents very rarely raised you in your own home. Instead, around the age of 7 or 8, you were sent away to serve in the household of another noble family, or perhaps a high-ranking church official.
It was essentially a mandatory exchange program for the elite. You functioned as a page, a henchman, or a maid. The sources note that prominent chancellors' men like Thomas Becket and William Longchamp maintained massive households that were essentially staffed by the fostered sons of the English nobility.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the psychology of this.
Yep.
If you are a wealthy, powerful noble, why would you send your own child away to be a servant for someone else, while simultaneously taking in a stranger's child to serve you? It seems entirely counterintuitive to the biological imperative of protecting your offspring.
The ETS sources actually include a brilliant outside perspective on this exact question. It comes from a document known as the Italian Relation of England. It was written by a foreign observer, likely a Venetian ambassador, who was touring England and observing their customs. And his conclusion about why the English foster their children is brutally cynical.
It is scathing. The Italian observer writes that the English send their children away because they are, quote, great epicures and very avaricious. He essentially claims that the English nobility are selfish gluttons.
Pretty much.
They prefer to be served by strangers because they want to eat all the best, most delicate, most expensive food themselves. They want to leave the coarse bread and the cold, leftover baked meats for the household staff. He argues that if the English kept their own children at home, they would feel biological guilt or social pressure to feed their kids the good food. So, to keep the best cuts of meat for themselves, they ship their kids off.
It's a jaw-dropping accusation of terrible parenting. Now, the observer does note the English defense of this practice. When confronted, the English claimed they did this to teach the children better manners.
Right.
The cultural logic was that parents are inherently too soft, too emotionally attached to their own children to discipline them properly. A stranger, however, won't coddle your child. A stranger will force them to learn courtesy, to master carving, and to show absolute, unquestioning obedience.
And when they say force, they mean it in the most literal, violent sense imaginable. The physical brutality of this educational system is really hard to overstate. It was relentless. The EETS sources pull from the famous Paston family letters, which are an incredible primary source for 15th century life. There is a letter from Agnes Paston, a wealthy, aristocratic mother, writing to her contacts in London regarding her 15-year-old son, Clement.
This letter is so intense.
She is writing to Clement's master, his tutor, and she explicitly demands that the master truly belash him till he will amend.
Belash him, to beat him with a lash, a whip. This is a mother ordering the flogging of her own 15-year-old son. And she adds a chilling justification, noting that his former master at Cambridge had done the same, and it was the only way to make him learn.
But the way Agnes treats her daughter is even worse. Another relative writes a letter documenting how Agnes behaves toward her daughter, Elizabeth, who is of marriageable age. The letter states that Elizabeth has been beaten once in the week or twice, and sometimes twice on a day, and her head broken in 2 or 3 places.
Her head broken in 2 or 3 places. By her own mother.
Over a dispute about a marriage arrangement, the absolute normalization of extreme physical violence as a tool for teaching obedience is terrifying. And this wasn't just the Paston family. It was the standard pedagogical theory of the entire era. The EETS texts quote the tragic account of Lady Jane Grey, the famous 9 Days Queen.
Yes.
She's known as one of the most highly educated young women in Europe. But she recounts her home life to the scholar Roger Ascham, and it is just heartbreaking.
Lady Jane Grey's account provides a vivid window into the psychological terror these children lived under. What exactly does she tell Ascham?
She tells him that when she is in the presence of her parents, she is paralyzed by fear. I have the exact quote here. She says, "Whether I speak, keep silence, sit, stand or go, eat, drink, be merry or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, I must do it. Even so perfectly as God made the world, or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, yea, presently sometimes with pinches, nippes, and bobs, that I think myself in hell." She tells Ascham that the only time she feels any relief, any sense of safety, is when she is studying with her gentle tutor, Mr. Aylmer, because he actually encourages her instead of hitting her.
Pinches, nips, and bobs. It sounds almost quaint to modern ears, but she is describing a state of constant, unpredictable, low-level physical and psychological torment. She could never relax. Her body was never her own.
Never.
The sources also mention a boy named Sir Peter Carew. His parents were so frustrated with his inability to conform to their strict rules that they literally chained him like a dog in the Hockham dog kennel until he managed to escape. And Roger Ascham himself notes that boys were regularly running away from the prestigious Eton school specifically because they were terrified of the daily beatings.
This forces me to ask a really profound question about the literature the ETS is preserving. If an entire culture normalizes the outsourcing of parental affection, if their upper classes are raised in a system where daily, severe physical beatings are the primary mechanism for learning, how does that collective generational trauma shape the tone of the language, the letters, and the stories they leave behind?
That is the exact analytical leap the ETS wants the reader to make. When you look at medieval and early modern literature through the lens of this childhood trauma, certain patterns become glaringly obvious.
Like what?
You see a massive preoccupation with absolute authority, divine punishment, and strict, unwavering hierarchies. The literature reflects a worldview where power is absolute and mercy is incredibly rare because that was their lived experience from the moment they could walk.
Survival depended entirely on compliance.
Exactly. The harsh, pragmatic, on-the-job training in these noble houses prioritized physical performance over intellectual curiosity. You learn to fold the napkin, play the lute, carve the meat, and ride the horse perfectly because your physical safety depended on it. Intellectual pursuit asking why instead of just doing what was actively discouraged because it challenged the hierarchy.
So we have this image of the noble kids essentially outsourced and beaten into submission in these grand, drafty dining halls, terrified of carving a bird incorrectly. But what about the kids who were actually sitting in classrooms? The universities must have been safer havens for intellectual development, right? I mean, Oxford and Cambridge were established by this point.
Well, that brings us to a fascinating evolution documented in the ETS forwards. Today, we view Oxford and Cambridge as the ultimate bastions of elite privilege, the playgrounds of the global wealthy. But the historical reality of their founding is completely the opposite. In the early Middle Ages, these universities were specifically designed and funded for poor men's sons.
Oh, this makes me think of Chaucer's Clerk of Oxenford from the Canterbury Tales. He's the classic starving student. His clothes are threadbare, his horse is incredibly skinny, and he spends every single penny he can beg from his friends on books instead of food.
That archetype was completely based in reality. Wealthy men and noblemen initially viewed funding these universities as an act of Christian charity. They were providing endowments to help exceptionally apt, intelligent, but impoverished boys get a formal education, usually so they could enter the priesthood or the church bureaucracy.
Okay, that makes sense.
The nobility didn't send their own sons there because, as we discussed, their sons were busy learning to joust and carve meat in other noble households. Formal academic study was seen as the domain of the poor cleric.
But then a massive societal shift happens. How exactly did the wealthy end up taking over the universities?
It was a gradual realization of power. As the state apparatus grew more complex, the nobility began to realize that formal education, literacy, legal knowledge, administrative skills held immense political and social value. And the moment the rich realized the universities were valuable, they systematically moved in and took them over.
A tale as old as time. The rich realize something is useful and push everyone else out. But mechanically, how did they do it? Were they just buying their way in?
The EETS texts cite numerous complaints from the era detailing exactly how this happened. It was a combination of networking, bribery, and the co-opting of charitable endowments. College masters would favor the sons of powerful lords to gain political favor.
Right, of course.
As a result, poor, incredibly intelligent students were systematically pushed out of university placements to make room for wealthy, often completely unapt noblemen's sons. The charitable endowments meant for the starving clerks were swallowed up by the elite. It's a direct historical parallel to modern legacy admissions or college bribery scandals. The mechanism of exclusion just evolved.
That is incredibly relatable. So once these wealthy students secured their spots at Oxford or Cambridge, what exactly were they studying? The ETS sources provide a breakdown of the curriculum, and it is highly structured. It was split into two sequential parts, the trivium and the quadrivium.
This is the foundation of the classical liberal arts education. You could not move to the quadrivium until you had completely mastered the trivium. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic.
Let's break down how that actually works mechanically in building a scholar, because grammar to us just means learning where to put a comma.
In the medieval university, grammar was the mechanics of language itself, understanding the structure of reality through words. Once you understood the structure of language, you moved to logic, which is the mechanics of thought, how to construct a valid argument and identify fallacies. And finally, rhetoric, which is the mechanics of persuasion, how to use grammar and logic to convince an audience.
It's a brilliant progression. First, you learn to structure a sentence. Then you learn to structure a thought. Then you learn to wield that thought as a weapon. And once you mastered the trivium, you graduated to the quadrivium: arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy.
What is fascinating about the quadrivium is that music was considered a mathematical science. It was the study of proportional relationships and harmony, closely linked to astronomy and the music of the spheres. But there is a glaring omission in this entire curriculum.
Yes. Notice what language we are not talking about: English. And for a long time, Greek was missing too. The sources note that the study of Greek was only introduced to the English university system very late, around the year 1500, by humanist scholars like Erasmus, Linacre, and Grocyn. But the absolute intentional neglect of the English language in English schools is the most shocking revelation here.
This is where we see the fierce academic battle for the English language emerge. All serious academic, legal, and theological work was conducted in Latin. Latin was the universal language of the educated European elite. English was considered a vulgar, base language fit only for the uneducated peasants. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you did not write in English.
Which means we have generations of brilliant English minds who are completely alienated from their native tongue. The ETS highlights two pioneering educators who tried to fix this: Richard Mulcaster in 1582 and John Brinsley in 1612. These men had to aggressively advocate for the study of English in English grammar schools.
Mulcaster's arguments are fascinating. He framed the purity and capability of the native English tongue as a matter of national honor. He was essentially looking at the academic establishment and saying, we have this robust, expressive, beautiful language right here, forged by our own ancestors. Why are we actively ignoring it to force our children to memorize Latin declensions?
Yeah, why are we doing this?
He begged for English to be treated with the same academic rigor and respect as the classical languages.
And John Brinsley pointed out the practical absurdity of the situation. He complained that he had scholars who could write perfectly elegant, complex treatises in Latin, but if you asked them to write down their own thoughts in English, they couldn't do it purely or readily. They were functionally illiterate in their own native emotions.
The irony is monumental. Think about the global position of the English language today. It is the dominant language of international business, global science, aviation, and the internet. It is an absolute juggernaut. Yet, in its infancy, its own academic institutions refused to teach it. Visionary educators had to plead and fight just to get it on the syllabus.
And if we tie this all the way back to the early English Tech Society's mission that we discussed in the beginning, this reveals exactly why their work was so revolutionary. By dedicating massive amounts of academic rigor, international funding, and painstaking translation to preserving early English texts, Furnivall and the ETs were finally fulfilling Richard Mulcaster's 16th century dream.
They absolutely were.
They were proving, once and for all, that the vulgar tongue had a rich, complex, and vital history worthy of supreme academic study.
They were validating the linguistic heritage of the ordinary person. But to truly validate it, to truly understand the context of this language they were saving, the ETS editors knew they couldn't just present the words on a page. They had to strip away the romance entirely and show the reader what the world actually looked and smelled like when those words were spoken.
Which brings us to the final, most visceral part of our deep dive. The gritty, physical reality of early English life. The dirt, the disease, and the diet. The ETS editors deliberately included extensive historical context about the living conditions of the time because, as we established earlier, you cannot separate a text from the environment in which it was written.
And the environment was, to put it bluntly, a public health catastrophe. The sources include a famous, deeply disturbing letter written by Erasmus, the great Renaissance humanist scholar we mentioned earlier, who helped bring Greek to Oxford. Erasmus traveled extensively in England, and he wrote a letter to the physician of Cardinal Wolsey detailing his observations of English homes.
I'm going to warn you right now, this description is going to ruin your appetite. Erasmus specifically describes the floors of English houses, not just peasant hovels, but the homes of the wealthy as well.
We talked about the rushes at the beginning of the show, but Erasmus provides the exact mechanical breakdown of why they were so dangerous. He writes that the floors are made of clay and then strewed with marsh rushes.
And the crucial detail is how they managed these rushes. They didn't sweep them out every week. Erasmus notes that occasionally they would throw a fresh layer of rushes on top, but they would leave the foundational layers untouched, sometimes for up to 20 years.
20 years.
And he explicitly lists what is fermenting in that 20-year-old compost heap in the middle of the living room. Spittle, vomit, the urine of dogs and men, spilled beer, fish bones, and, as he delicately puts it, other dirt not to be named.
It is a 20-year accumulation of biological waste trapped indoors. Erasmus, who was remarkably forward-thinking regarding public health, explicitly linked this absolute filth to the rampant diseases that regularly devastated the English population. He specifically mentions the plagues and the terrifying sweating sicknesses.
Let's define the sweating sickness, because it's one of the most horrifying medical mysteries in history. It wasn't the bubonic plague. It was a completely different, highly virulent disease that struck England in waves during the Tudor period.
Mechanically, the sweating sickness was terrifying because of its rapid onset. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy, start experiencing a sense of dread and a severe fever by noon, begin sweating profusely, and be dead before dinner.
Just hours.
It struck with overwhelming speed, and no one knew how it was transmitted. We still don't know exactly what pathogen caused it, though some modern theories suggest a type of hantavirus.
And Erasmus looks at these sealed, unventilated houses with 20 years of rotting vomit and urine on the floor, and he connects the dots. He notes that the windows in English houses were often designed to let in light but couldn't be opened, so this noxious vapor, this miasma from the rushes, just hung stagnant in the air of the house.
They contrast that unimaginable squalor with the incredible, ostentatious luxury that existed simultaneously in the exact same physical space. The economic disparity and the bizarre prioritization of resources are staggering. The ETS texts mention historical records of 1,000 citizens of Genoa visiting England clothed entirely in silk, a fabric of immense, almost astronomical cost at the time.
And the food. They are walking on floors soaked in animal waste, but they're throwing feasts that defy belief. The sources describe a wedding feast where 60 oxen were slaughtered and consumed. 60 oxen for one party. And the complexity of the dishes they made. The text mentions a culinary creation called a gallimaufry.
Oh, it's a fantastic word. A gallimaufry was essentially a chaotic culinary mashup.
It was a massive dish where roasted meats, fish, heavily spiced sweets, fruits, and thick sauces were all jumbled and baked together. It completely shocked later more refined dietary observers who couldn't fathom the digestive fortitude required to eat it. It was an era of absolute extremes. Extreme filth and extreme heavy opulence coexisting without any sense of contradiction.
But what is truly fascinating from a psychological perspective is the intense historical resistance to changing these conditions. When new technologies emerged that could have improved hygiene and air quality, the population pushed back. They didn't want to clean up.
No, they thought the dirt and the smoke were actually making them stronger. The sources quote a 16th century writer named William Harrison who wrote a description of England. And Harrison is bitterly complaining about the modern introduction of chimneys and proper oak-framed houses. He literally argues that having chimneys to vent smoke out of the house was making Englishmen soft. He calls the new clean air generation willow men.
He was nostalgic for the good old days when rooms were built of softer willow wood but were constantly filled with thick, choking smoke from an open fire in the center of the hall.
Right. His logic is baffling, but fascinating. He argued that the constant thick wood smoke hardened the timber of the house, and therefore it must physically harden the bodies of the people living inside it. He claimed that the smoke kept them from catching colds, or the pose, as they called a head cold. He genuinely believed that breathing in thick particulate matter all day was a profound medical benefit, and that chimneys were a sign of moral and physical decay.
This specific anecdote brings us to a critical analytical point about historical text preservation. Why does the early English text society include these gruesome details about dirt, unventilated smoke, and bizarre dietary excesses in a volume dedicated to rescuing poetry and grammar? Because understanding the squalor is an absolute prerequisite for reading early texts accurately.
It completely shifts the context of the literature.
Exactly. Let's look at medieval poetry. When a medieval poet writes a soaring, beautiful verse about the sanctuary of a walled garden, or spends 3 stanzas describing the pure, sweet scent of a rose, modern readers often view that as just a polite, slightly boring literary trope. We think, oh, they just liked flowers.
But when you add the context of the rushes, the poetry changes entirely.
Yes. The poetry is not a gentle appreciation of nature. It is a desperate psychological escape from the overwhelming literal stench of their daily lives. The walled garden represents the only place they could breathe clean air. The scented rose is a physical necessity to mask the smell of rotting meat and urine on the floor. If you do not know about the biological reality of the rushes, the poetry loses its urgency, its stakes, and its true meaning.
That is such a brilliant, illuminating point. It makes me think of the modern phenomenon of the perfectly curated social media influencer. You see this beautifully aesthetic photo, soft lighting, a perfect latte, pristine white sheets. But what you don't see is that just 1 inch out of the camera's frame, the bedroom is covered in piles of dirty laundry, empty takeout containers, and trash.
Exactly.
The medieval poetry is the curated post. What Furnivall and the ETs did by publishing the Book of Nurture and the historical prefaces was zoom the camera out to show us the whole room. Garbage, smoke, rushes, and all.
And that is the true, enduring value of what Furnivall and his international colleagues accomplish. They didn't just preserve a sanitized highlight reel of the English language. They refused to separate the art from the brutal, messy environment that created it. They preserved the holistic reality of the society that forged the words we use today.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's pull all these fascinating threads together. We started with a small group of highly dedicated academics in 1864, scraping by on 1 guinea subscriptions, begging the British public to care about crumbling manuscripts. But the early English Text Society didn't just preserve dead words on a page. Through their global collaboration, their international brotherhood of the book, they rescued the total human experience of early England.
They gave us the strict life-or-death manners of the carving table and the fear of the trumps. They gave us the brutal psychological toll of the fostering system, where children were beaten to ensure survival and compliance. They documented the centuries-long academic struggles to make English a respected language in its own universities. And they steadfastly refused to shy away from the dirty, smoky, disease-ridden physical reality of the people who spoke it.
So here's my promise to you, the listener, fulfilled. The next time you read Shakespeare or Chaucer or any historical text, I want you to remember the physical reality behind those words. The people writing those beautiful sonnets and epic tales were not ethereal beings floating in a romantic past. They were real humans who worried intensely about carving meat correctly, who survived the pinches, nips, and bobs of their tutors, and who had to carefully pick their way across the damp, fermenting muck in the rushes on their own living room floors.
It makes their literary achievements all the more remarkable. To create enduring beauty amidst such incredible harshness and rigid social control is a testament to the resilience of the human mind.
It really is. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, applying this exact framework to our own lives. Back in 1904, the EETS casually stated they had at least 200 years of work left just to preserve the past. They were looking forward, knowing the work of cultural preservation is never truly done. So I want you to imagine a global academic society in the year 2200. Imagine them digging into our massive, messy digital archives to understand our social history. What mundane modern document will be our book of nurture? What text will historians point to and say, this explains how they actually lived? Will it be a highly upvoted Reddit thread on the rigid etiquette of writing corporate emails? Will it be a frantic YouTube tutorial on optimizing your Zoom background to hide your messy apartment? Or will it be the unwritten, highly structured rules for who gets to speak in a group chat? Because whatever that document is, complete with all our modern anxieties, unspoken rules, and hidden digital filth, it will be the ultimate key for the future to understand exactly who we were.